There is an incredibly scary and at the exact same time extremely liberating truth that is being revealed in positive psychology lately. Over the last 25 years, the field of positive psychology has brought forth a lot of amazing research, but the most crazy insight out of all of it, and it's becoming the core insight of positive psychology, is that as people, we are not actually being driven by the past. In other words, who you are now is not based on your past. Instead, who you are right now is actually based on the future that you most expect for yourself. So that is the craziest insight is that as a person, even you right now, you listening to this video or you watching this video, you are who you are and you're doing what you're doing based on the future that you most expect for yourself. The psychological term for this is called prospection. Prospection is the idea that as people, we are operating based on the prospects we have for the future and more directly, based on the future that we most commit to. In fact, the psychological definition of identity is that which you're most committed to. It's also the story you have of yourself. It's the language that you have of yourself. There's a full theory on this called the theory of narrative identity. The main idea here is that the language you use is shaping your story. It's shaping your narrative, but it's also shaping your perception. There's a great book on this by Dr. Logan. He's a USC professor, and it's called The 3 Laws of Performance. And in that book, they talk about the concept of default future. We all have a default future, and that future, based on perspection, is the future we most expect. And that future that we most expect is what's driving everything we're doing now. So you have a future in your mind. It's a default future. It's the future that you most believe in and most expect. And our brains are essentially prediction machines and even probability machines. So you have a default future, and that future is driving your life right now. And it's the future that you most expect. It's the future that you most anticipate. It's the one that you believe is most probable. And so if a person is just kind of going through the motions, they're working a job they hate, that's because that's the future that they most expect. That's the future that they've accepted as their reality. What a lot of the research shows in this field in positive psychology, there's a researcher named Dr. Daniel Gilbert, is that we take the present and we project that into the future. We overvalue our present selves, our present emotions, and we use that to undervalue the future. We actually, not only do we undervalue the future, but we also overly take the present and just say that that's what the future is going to be. Our default future is not much different from the present. Maybe it's slightly better, slightly worse, but you are on a path, and you know what that path is if you were honest with yourself, and it's the path that you most expect to happen. And so that's your default future. One of the things that Dr. Daniel Gilbert says is that most people don't think about the future, they don't imagine it, and they have lack of imagination skills, and so they're just honestly not thinking about it. You want to create the future that you want, and you want to start operating from that future. Albert Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. But right now, I'm going to share with you a concept that I learned while writing this book, 10x is easier than 2x. I learned this from an AI expert and entrepreneur named Howard Getson. So this concept is called fitness function. And basically what fitness function is the concept that describes the standard or goal to which you're operating. And the cool part is that we all can actually choose the goal, and our brains are so powerful. We can choose the goal or standard even if it seems impossible, and then our brains can start working on it. This is called selective attention in psychology, that you can actually channel your mind, channel your attention towards something and start figuring it out. It's similar to when America decided that they were going to go to the moon in less than a decade. We had never done that before, but we actually set a target, even if it was a seemingly impossible target. We gave ourselves a really ridiculous deadline, which is super effective. Parkinson's law says that work fills the space you give it. And so those are two really important points, is giving yourself a really specific outcome or result or milestone, even if it's impossible, such as going to the moon, super effective, and then giving yourself a really tight timeline. Because then that gets your brain to focus on it, break it down really effectively. Rather than operating towards a default future, which is the future that you most expect, and there's a lot of research on expectancy. Even there's a concept called the Pygmalion effect, that as people, largely we're operating based on what we most expect and also what we think others expect of us. And so expectations and the expectation effect, and even expectancy theory, which is the core theory in motivation, what you expect is largely what you're going to create, and that's based on just your recurring thought process. There are 2 fundamental skills that are going to determine how successful you are. One is choosing the future you want, getting really good at the skill of imagination. Imagination is a skill. So it's choosing the future that you most want, regardless of what anyone else thinks about it, regardless of how seemingly possible it is. This is even a key point that he makes in the book Mastery, Robert Greene. He said that anyone who becomes a master ultimately leaves the pack and they pursue their own pathway. Anyone who's become a true master, we're talking artists, innovators, anyone who's become a true master and ultimately changed the world, they stopped following the pack and they did what they wanted and they followed their own pursuit. They went their own way and it was often the road less traveled, often the road never traveled. That's what a pioneer is. They stopped following the path and they went their own way. And so the two keys to success is ultimately choosing what you most want and getting better and better at elevating what you want. And then secondly, learning how to train your brain and your identity and your level of commitment such that you can realize that. And you can get really good at this, about choosing better things, even choosing seemingly impossible things. That would be step one, is choosing something. And Richard Koch talks a lot about this in Unreasonable Success. The what is more important than the how. The what is what you're actually pursuing. That's the future. We all have a future. Most of us have a default future that we've just accepted or committed to. Another way of looking at it is that your default future is the future you're most committed to. And back to the core definition of identity, your identity is what you're most committed to. So your default future fits a lot with your identity. Your identity is the narrative that you have or the language and the thoughts that you're progressively doing. So the two key concepts here are getting better and better at choosing the what, which is whatever it is you truly want, and getting better and better at taking it and taking your identity and getting committed to it, and then building small wins, building progress, having transformational experiences such that that becomes the future that you most expect. You ultimately want to get to the point where your highly imagined, seemingly impossible future is the one that you most expect. It's the one that your brain most sees. It's the one that you're thinking about the most. It's the one that you're talking about. You go from a place of thinking to feeling to knowing, and you get to a place of commitment. Once you get to a place of commitment, then it is your identity. Then it's essentially a point of no return, and now you're no longer operating from your former self. You're actually operating from your future self. The key thing here is that you have a default future, and that future is the future that you're most committed to, and it's also the one you most expect. It's not the one you most want, it's the one you most expect. And that the two massive key skills here are getting to the point where you choose what you most want, choosing the what, and then ultimately mastering the how. And the how is shifting your commitment such that you're going for what you want. You get to the place of progressing on that, starting to build small wins and having transformational experiences, which ultimately boosts your confidence and expectation that it's going to happen. And you can get to the point where you most expect and most predict, your brain most expects and predicts the thing that you want, your imagined future self, even your seemingly impossible future self. And you start to build so much evidence on a daily basis that it's just, not only does it become the most expected and probable future to you, but it also becomes the most expected and probable future to everyone around you, where other people start talking about your future self, even if you never brought it up. I've had this experience where people start talking to me about the future that I most want and most expect, because now that's what they most expect. They're actually seeing that I'm trending in that direction. And so I've not only trained my own brain and my own reality and my own identity, but now I'm training the outside world to see and expect the future that I want, not the default future. And you can do that. Imagination is more important than knowledge. And as you start making progress towards your goals, as you start seeing it, feeling it, and knowing it is getting to a place of confidence and expectation, you start operating from the future, start behaving from the future. Your identity drives your behavior. And so as you start thinking about it, expecting it, seeing it, and you're not attached to it. You want it, you expect it, but you're not attached. You can even get to the place of full commitment without being attached. And as you start building evidence on that and start seeing more and more of your future self on a daily basis and operating more and more as your future self on a daily basis, you start to accumulate so much evidence such that it just becomes the most probable, most expected future, not only to you, but to everyone else. So that's the key. And that's the most crazy insight in positive psychology, is that we are driven by the future that we most expect, our default future. And that's what perspection is all about. And that you as an intelligent being has the ability to shape intentions. Think about the idea of an intention. It was an idea to go to the moon before we actually did it. And that actually fits with the idea of prospection and even what's called teleology, is that it's actually the goal that shapes the process. And the goal is always a thought first. It was a thought, an idea, a decision first, before we didn't just randomly go to the moon. It was a decision to go to the moon. And then everything we did was driven by that goal. Think about building a house. You don't just randomly happen upon a house. You actually have the decision to build a house. You build a blueprint, which is like the mental creation. This is what Stephen Covey said: mental creation precedes physical creation. Those are the two skills, is deciding what to mentally or spiritually create, and then getting good at physically constructing it, which is shifting your identity, building that evidence, and ultimately getting to the place where it's the most probable, expected, predicted outcome. I'm Dr. Benjamin Hardy. I hope you enjoyed that. I break a lot of this down in Be Your Future Self Now. This just barely came out on paperback. So if you haven't, grab this book. A lot of the research on future self, Tony Robbins gave the blurb on the cover. He said, Dr. Benjamin Hardy has laid out the groundwork in science so that you can not only know your future self intimately, but also so that you can transform your life. Grab a copy of Be Your Future Self Now. Have an amazing day. Talk to you later.